Hey everyone, and welcome to Brent's Notepad, where ideas become insight. I'm Brent Shelton, inviting you to think deeper, lead better, and live more intentionally. In each episode, I dive into big questions and meaningful ideas drawn from books, research, and real life. Today, we're beginning a new series diving into the book Exploring Leadership, the second edition, written by Richard Bolden, Jonathan Gosling, and Beverley Hawkins. In this episode, we dive into Chapter 1 as it sets the stage for how we think about leadership, not just as a set of traits, but as a complex, socially embedded process that challenges many of our assumptions. So, think about it. Leadership is everywhere. It shows up in the news, and movies, and sports, and in our workplaces. And yet, for something that seems so familiar, leadership is still one of the hardest things to actually define. But why is that? It's because it's not just technical. It's not just about skills or personality. It's wrapped up in culture, history, power, and even our beliefs about what it means to be human. So, this raises a big question. Is leadership something a person has, like charisma or confidence? Or is it something that only exists in relationships, in the space between people? The authors of this book lean more towards the second answer. Leadership, they say, isn't a personal possession. It's something that emerges in interactions shaped by context, symbols, and networks of power. And when you look at leadership in this way, a lot of things start to change. For one, you can't boil leadership down to a personality quiz or a neat little checklist. Leadership in the military is going to look very different from leadership in a sales team or in a nonprofit organization or a government agency. It's the same concept, but radically different expressions because leadership is always shaped by the context. This also messes with one of the most popular distinctions people love to make. That is, leaders versus managers. You've probably heard it. Managers keep the train running, and leaders chart the new path. Sounds good on paper, right? But here's the problem. Real leadership requires both. In today's complex world, vision without execution falls flat, and organizations without adaptability quickly become irrelevant. The authors call for what is known as leader managers. People who can balance stability and change, planning and vision, structure and innovation. Now, another debate that goes on behind the scenes of leadership discourse is the philosophical question, which asks whether knowledge can be gained through objective observations or if it's more subjective, relying on personal interpretations. In other words, can leadership be objectively measured? Or is it more of a sliding scale that relies on subjective interpretations of social actors? Now, here's why the answer to this philosophical question matters. If leadership could be classified as a purely objective subject, then technically even the most unethical figures could be considered good leaders. And that's the provocation that the authors throw at us in Chapter 1. They ask, was Hitler the most archetypal evil figure you can think of? Was Hitler a good leader? If you are using effectiveness alone as an objective measure, then you could say yes, he was a great leader. However, if you include a more subjective matter such as values and purpose and ethics, well, your opinion might change pretty quickly. And that's part of why leadership scholars call leadership an essentially contested concept, where different cultures, different groups, different people will define leadership in competing ways. And guess what? There really is no single definition that everyone agrees on. And instead of seeing this as a big problem, I think this is why leadership is so fascinating. It forces us to keep wrestling with and questioning and refining the very nature of leadership itself. So, I bet you're wondering, how do we develop leaders in the middle of all this complexity and subjectivity? Well, The answer is not memorizing traits or copying someone else's style. Actually, the authors argue that leadership has to be lived and practiced and reflected on. And that's why they encourage things like keeping a leadership journal and observing how others lead, asking better questions, and testing out what you learn in real life situations. Now, luckily, the authors don't leave us completely in the dark. To make sense of all this complexity, the authors call on previous scholarship to offer us 6 different perspectives on leadership in what they describe as the 6 Ps. First, you can consider the person, their traits, characteristics, and who they are as an individual. Second, there's position, the authority or the role someone holds. Third, leadership can be understood as a process, the relationships and interactions that happen between people. Fourth, you can think about performance, the outcomes, results, what actually gets accomplished. Fifth is purpose, which is the missions and values or the why behind leadership. And finally, there's perspective, the cultural and contextual lens that shapes how leadership is seen and practiced. Now, what makes each of these 6 Ps so interesting is that they give us a different angle or lens in which we see leadership. And when you put them all together, you start to see leadership in a much fuller and nuanced way. And that's especially relevant right now. Think about the challenges we're facing: climate change, inequality, and digital transformation. These aren't problems that one heroic leader can solve alone. They require adaptive, ethical, and inclusive leadership. That means we need ways of thinking, studying, and practicing leadership that bring in diverse voices and multiple perspectives. So, where does this leave us? Chapter 1 reminds us that leadership isn't a fixed recipe. It's messy and dynamic and deeply human. And it's worth wrestling with because the way we define leadership shapes the way we live it out. All right, that's it for Chapter 1. I'd like to thank you for joining me as we set the stage for this series on exploring leadership. In our next episode, we'll dive into Chapter 2, where we discuss some of the core theories that have shaped leadership studies and how they play out in practice. That's it for today's episode. Thanks for listening to Brent's Notepad, where ideas become insight. Until next time, lead better, think deeper, and live more intentionally.